When teaching beginners how to squat, I tell them about the 3 exercise criteria necessary for getting as strong as possible. Number 1, we are going to use exercises which use the most amount of muscle possible. Therefore, we're going to use the type of squat which trains the most amount of muscle. Secondly, we're going to use the most amount of weight possible with perfect form. And then third, we're going to use the greatest effective range of motion, and this is what I want to talk to you about today. You see, the first 2 criteria, most amount of muscle mass with the most amount of weight, is pretty intuitive. But that last one, the greatest effective range of motion, trips a lot of people up. One of the hardest things to do as a beginner is to really nail that bottom position or hitting depth where your hips go lower than the knees. Most people have this idea that in order to hit depth, they have to go ass to grass or bring their ass all the way to their ankles. But we teach people how to do the low bar squat so that we can fulfill the exercise criteria 1 and 2 much better. Remember, that's the most amount of muscle mass with the most amount of weight possible. No other squat trains as much muscle mass and allows for as much weight to be lifted as the low bar squat. So we put the bar low on our back so that we can lean over. And we want to be able to lean over so that we can have access to all that muscle mass in the posterior chain. It can't be done any other way. And this brings us to depth. If the bar's low on our back and we're leaning over, reaching our hips way back, we can't go too low. Because if we go too low, something will get loose. This is usually the low back or the hamstrings. And when those muscles lose tension, we can't move as much weight, and that's in direct violation of criteria number 2, using the most amount of weight possible. So when I'm instructing depth, a full range of motion low bar squat, I just want to see them get their hips slightly below the tops of their knees. This can be seen as the hip crease, where your pants fold, where your pockets are, getting just below the top of the knee. To the untrained observer, this looks too high. But to the experienced coach and lifter, familiar with the low bar squat, this is the perfect amount of depth, because again, going much lower than this is not productive, because if we do, muscles will get loose. Therefore, we're not training as much muscle mass as possible, and therefore we won't be able to use as much weight as possible. First thing I do with the beginner when I'm teaching them how to squat is I get them into the bottom position. No weight, just an air squat. And I'm going to point out several of the details of the bottom position. I have them spend some time there and then practice getting in and out of it. It's really important for them to form a solid understanding of the bottom position, because this is usually where all the problems with the squat occur. A bad rep is really a product of poorly getting into the bottom position or poorly getting out of it. So we have to start with a good understanding of where depth is and where the tension needs to be. Take a stance about shoulder width apart, toes pointed out about 30 degrees. I'll have them put their hands together in a prayer position and then shove their elbows in between their knees, using their elbows to shove their knees out in the direction of their toes. And then I'll have them sit. I'll guide them in until their hip crease is just lower than the tops of their knees. This is a perfect amount of depth. I'm not lacking in anything here. Going any lower will not allow me to train any more musculature. If I do go lower, I will get loose in my lower back, begin to round, and my hamstrings will slack as well as my inner thigh muscles. So the beginner needs to spend some time running a diagnostics check of their bottom position to find When are my hips below the tops of my knees? Where is it most tight? Will it get tighter if I go down? Will it get tighter if I go up? And what is too high? Ideally, the beginner needs to know where depth is without any sort of external aid. They need to know the sensation of good depth, which is a massive amount of tension on the inner thigh muscles, the glutes, and the hamstrings. So they need to know when is low enough, and they need to pay attention to that stretch of glutes, hamstrings, and inner thighs. When they begin to feel slack, they know they've gone too far. So remember, a tight muscle is a muscle under load, and a muscle under load is a muscle that's being trained. So get the idea out of your head that you have to squat ass to grass in order to get the full training effect of a squat, because it couldn't be any further from the truth. Most ass to grass squats require you to get loose somewhere very important that you don't want to lose tension in, like your lumbar spine and your hamstrings, and therefore they're not getting trained. So no matter what kind of squat you're doing, keep your bottom position tight. That's how you have power out of the hole. Now, a front squat and a high bar squat can use more depth, and you should go lower. But again, the universal rule here is to not get loose in the bottom position. And if you're low bar squatting, you have to know where to cut it off. And as a beginner, learning where depth is and is not is one of the most important things you can do.